The sun had barely lifted over the jagged Montana hills when Clara Bennett started her morning chores. The light broke soft and gold over the valley, washing her lonely homestead in a tender glow. It should have been beautiful, peaceful even, but to Clara it only reminded her of how empty her world had become. Her days passed quietly, marked only by the creak of the water bucket, the whisper of wind through the grass, and the far-off cry of meadowlarks. She'd learned to live alone, and she told herself that was enough. Down by the river, she crouched to fill her pail, her reflection rippling in the cold current. She looked older than her 33 years, though her eyes were clear, steady, eyes of a woman who had lost much and somehow still stood. The faint scent of pine and wet earth wrapped around her. But another sound soon broke the quiet, the sharp crack of a wagon wheel. Her head lifted, muscles tensing. Through the mist rising off the water, a wagon came into view on the far bank, one wheel sunk deep in mud. A man stood beside it, hat tipped low, his hands braced on his hips. Two children, one small boy and a girl perhaps 10, stood nearby, their faces pinched with worry. Clara hesitated. Strangers were rare this far out, and she had long ago learned caution. But when the man looked up and met her eyes across the river, something in his expression, a mix of weariness and simple honesty, made her pause. He called out, voice rough but polite. "Ma'am, hate to trouble you, but I could use a hand." Clara set her bucket down slowly. She didn't like being called ma'am. It made her feel older than she already did. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Wheels slipped in the mud. "Ain't moving no matter how I push. Name's Luke Callahan," he said. "My young'uns and I are on our way to town. Didn't reckon the riverbank'd be this soft." The boy tugged on his sleeve, and Luke gave him a reassuring pat. Something about the gesture, the easy patience of it, struck Clara. She'd seen men like him before, strong, sun-worn and steady, but carrying that quiet kind of tiredness you can't wash off with rest. She could have turned away, told herself it wasn't her concern. But watching the children, mud up to their knees, eyes wide with uncertainty, something in her heart softened. "Wait there," she called. "I'll fetch a rope." 10 minutes later, she was on her knees beside the stuck wheel, hands muddy and hair slipping from its braid. Luke worked beside her, his shirt rolled to the elbows, his tone respectful, never assuming. When the wagon finally lurched free with a loud groan, he laughed softly, relief plain in his face. "Reckon I owe you more than a thank you," he said. Clara shook her head, brushing off her skirt. "Just glad it's done. Roads wash out fast after spring rains. You'll want to take the North Trail." He nodded, tipping his hat. "Appreciate it, ma'am. The name's Luke Callahan. My little ones are Emma and Ben." Clara gave a stiff nod, ready to retreat back to her solitude. But Emma, the girl, surprised her, stepping forward with a shy smile. "Thank you, miss," she said softly, offering a small bunch of wildflowers she'd gathered from the roadside. For a long moment, Clara just stared at them, the petals trembling in the child's small hand. Something twisted in her chest. It had been years since anyone had given her flowers. She took them finally, her fingers brushing Emma's. "You're welcome," she murmured. Voice. Rough. Luke climbed back on the wagon, the reins creaking in his hands. "Maybe we'll see you in town sometime," he said, more as a kindness than expectation. But as the wagon rolled away and Clara watched their figures grow smaller against the horizon, she realized something unsettling. She hoped he was right. By the next morning, word had already reached town that Luke Callahan and his children had been helped out by the widow Bennett. In a small Montana settlement like Elk Hollow, news traveled faster than a prairie fire, carried on the breath of gossiping tongues and the squeak of the general store's swinging door. Clara Bennett's name hadn't been spoken kindly or cruelly for some time, just softly, as if folks were careful not to wake a ghost. Most remembered her tragedy like a story told too often. How her husband, Thomas, had died trying to save her from the fire that burned their cabin to the ground 3 winters ago. How she'd lost her unborn child that same night. And how she'd rebuilt what little she had alone. After that, Clara withdrew from everything, Church, socials, even the quilting circle. She'd become a figure in passing, the woman who kept to herself. When Luke Callahan's wagon rolled into town later that day, bound for supplies, a few shopkeepers mentioned her name. "You met Clara Bennett?" asked Mrs. Hensley at the dry goods counter, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Sweet lady, though she don't talk much. Poor thing's had her share of sorrow." Luke gave a polite nod, not one to feed gossip. "She helped me out of a jam, that's all," he said simply. But something in his tone, quiet respect, maybe gratitude, made Mrs. Hensley smile knowingly. "Well, the Lord works in ways we don't expect," she murmured, and Luke only tipped his hat. Meanwhile, back at her homestead, Clara felt the weight of the town's whispering in her bones. She didn't go into Elk Hollow often, but she could feel it when people remembered her. The way the air in town seemed to hum with pity whenever she passed. That's why she stayed clear. Solitude was easier than sympathy. Yet all afternoon, her thoughts kept returning to the man by the river, the one with kind eyes and 2 children who looked at him like he hung the moon. She told herself she was only curious. After all, men came and went through this valley all the time, but she hadn't forgotten how natural it had felt to work beside him. The quiet understanding in the way he'd handed her the rope, careful not to overstep. She'd almost forgotten what it was like to be spoken to, not pitied, not judged, just spoken to as an equal. She tried to shake it off and threw herself into her chores. She hauled firewood, mended the chicken coop, even scrubbed the porch until her hands were raw. But come evening, as the sun bled gold across the western sky, she caught herself glancing toward the road, half expecting to see that wagon rolling past again. It never came. That night, sitting by the small fire inside her cabin, Clara ran her thumb over the withered petals of the wildflowers Emma had given her. She'd set them in a chipped jar by the window, telling herself it was only polite to keep them a while. But the truth was, she hadn't been able to throw them away. They made the place feel, if only for a heartbeat, like someone else had been there, like she wasn't entirely alone. She took out the worn journal she used more for comfort than writing. In it, she jotted down a few words. Met a rancher today. Kind. 2 little ones. Helped with his wagon. Then she paused, her pen hovering. After a long moment, she added, "Strange how the sound of laughter can follow you home." Outside, the prairie wind sighed through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of rain. Clara closed the journal and blew out the lamp. She told herself that Luke Callahan was a stranger, nothing more. But as she lay in bed, listening to the quiet creak of her cabin, she couldn't help but wonder why, for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel so heavy. The Double C Ranch stretched for miles across the Montana prairie, its fences silvered by dust and sun, its corrals worn thin from years of wind and work. To most men, it was a dream. Good grazing land, a solid herd, a homestead built from sweat and endurance. But to Luke Callahan, it had become something else entirely. A weight he bore alone. Before dawn, Luke was already up, coffee steaming in his hand as he watched the horizon from the porch. The sun rose pale behind the hills, lighting the pasture where a dozen cattle grazed lazily. Somewhere behind him, a door creaked open, and small bare feet padded across the wooden floor. "Pa?" came a sleepy voice. Little Ben, only 6, with hair the color of wheat and eyes too big for his face. Luke turned, his rough expression softening instantly. "Mornin', son," he said. "You're up early." "Can't sleep." "Emma says ghosts come 'fore sunrise." Luke chuckled quietly and scooped him up with one arm. "Ain't no ghosts here. Just you, me, and the wind." But he knew there were ghosts of another kind. Memories that lingered in the corners of the house, soft echoes of laughter that had long faded. His wife, Mary, had passed 3 years ago after a long illness, leaving behind 2 children and a man who didn't know how to fill the silence she left. He'd done his best. Kept the ranch running, the house standing, but something vital had gone missing. There was no warmth anymore, no song or softness in the air. Emma tried, bless her heart. At 10 years old, she took on more than she should have, helping in the kitchen, soothing her little brother when nightmares came. Luke often caught her trying to make biscuits that ended up flat as saddle leather, but he never said a word. She reminded him too much of Mary, not just in looks, but in her quiet determination. That afternoon, after the chores were done, Luke rode into town with Emma and Ben bouncing in the wagon beside him. He needed supplies, but truth be told, he needed conversation just as much. The long days on the range gave a man too much time to think. At the general store, he traded a few words with the shopkeeper, Mr. Lawson, about the coming winter and feed prices. But before long, Mrs. Hensley appeared again from behind the counter, eyes twinkling. "You know, Mr. Callahan," she began in that tone that meant she'd been thinking too much, "you could use a woman's help out there. 2 little ones and a whole ranch? That's too much for any man." Luke gave her a polite smile. "Appreciate the concern, ma'am, but we're getting by fine." She wasn't convinced. "There's good women in Elk Hollow who'd be glad for work. Housekeeping, teaching, that sort of thing." He shrugged, adjusting his hat. "I'll think on it." But that night, as he tucked the children into bed and the house fell quiet again, he did think on it. He thought about how Emma's hands had gone red from washing laundry in cold water, how Ben's voice had grown small since Mary's passing. He thought about the meals that were nothing but beans and biscuits, and how the rooms still smelled faintly of dust instead of bread or flowers. And then, inevitably, his mind went back to Clara Bennett, the way she'd stood by the river, calm and steady, unafraid to get her hands dirty. There had been something about her silence that wasn't cold, something that matched his own kind of loneliness. Maybe she understood what it meant to lose everything and still keep going. He didn't want another wife. He wasn't sure his heart could hold that kind of love again. But maybe what his family needed wasn't another mother or another promise. Maybe they just needed someone kind, someone gentle, someone who could bring back the sound of laughter. As the wind whispered across the plains outside, Luke decided he'd pay a visit to the widow Bennett's homestead again. Not for love, just for help, he told himself. But somewhere deep down, a part of him knew that wasn't entirely true. 3 days passed before Clara heard the sound of hooves again. She'd been splitting firewood behind her cabin when the steady rhythm reached her ears, measured, unhurried, familiar. She straightened, the axe still in her hands, as a rider appeared over the rise. Luke Callahan, hat tipped low, reins loose in one hand. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind tugged at the hem of her apron. A few sparrows darted through the air between them. Clara set the axe aside and folded her arms. "Mr. Callahan," she greeted, voice guarded but polite. "Ma'am," he said, dismounting easily. "Hope I'm not intrudin'. That depends," she replied. "You lost another wheel?" He smiled faintly, and for the first time she saw the lines at the corners of his eyes deepen, not from age, but from a man who'd learned to smile sparingly. "No, ma'am. Nothing so dramatic this time." He took off his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. "Truth is, I came to ask you something." "A favor of sorts." Clara's guard rose at once. "If it's about the wagon, I already helped you once." "I'm not much for—" He cut in gently. "It's not about me. It's about my kids," her words faltered. He went on, his tone steady but quiet, like a man trying not to push too hard. "Emma and Ben. They're good young'uns, but it's been a spell since they've had proper schooling. I can teach 'em how to mend a fence and drive cattle, but books and letters? That's another thing. Folks in town mentioned you used to teach at the mission school before you moved out here." Clara blinked. She hadn't expected that to follow her. "That was a long time ago," she said softly. "And I don't teach anymore." "I figured as much," Luke said, nodding. "Still, I thought maybe you'd consider helping them through the winter. I'd pay fair. Room, board, or coin, whatever you prefer." Her heart thudded unevenly. She turned away under the pretense of wiping her hands on her apron. The thought of spending days around those children, bright eyes, laughter, twisted something deep inside her. It wasn't dislike. It was fear. "I'm not the person you're looking for," she said finally. "You want someone cheerful, patient. Someone who—" Luke waited, calm as still water. "Someone who what, Miss Bennett?" She forced herself to meet his gaze. Someone who knows how to be part of a family. His eyes softened, but he didn't step closer. Reckon that's something you don't forget. Just takes time to remember. The words caught her off guard, gentle but heavy with meaning. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small pouch of coins. I don't expect an answer now. Just think on it. The ranch could use some kindness again, and the kids could use someone who cares. He set the pouch on the fence post, gave her a respectful nod, and turned back to his horse. Mr. Callahan, she called, almost without thinking. Why me? There are plenty of women in town. He paused, hand resting on the saddle. Because you didn't look away, he said simply. When you saw a man stuck in the mud with two scared children, you came running. That's all I need to know about a person. For a long moment after he rode off, Clara stood there, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. She stared at the pouch, then at the empty horizon beyond her fence line. Inside the cabin, the silence felt heavier than usual. She sat down by the table, tracing the grain of the wood beneath her fingers. She told herself she didn't need this, that she was better off alone. But when she looked toward the wildflowers still sitting in the chipped jar on her windowsill, she realized her heart had already started to waver. By nightfall, Clara blew out the lamp and whispered to herself, "Just for the winter." Nothing more. But deep down, even she didn't believe it. The morning Clara Bennett arrived at the Double C Ranch, the valley was still half asleep beneath a veil of frost. The wagon wheels creaked in the cold as she guided her mule up the winding trail. Her hands were tight on the reins, heart even tighter. She told herself this was just a job, a way to get through the winter, nothing more. Still, as the ranch came into view, smoke curling gently from the chimney, she felt a strange, almost painful flutter of nerves. It looked like a home, something she hadn't allowed herself to want in years. Luke Callahan met her at the gate, hat in hand, his expression quiet but welcoming. "Morning, Miss Bennett. Glad you decided to come." Clara nodded, stepping down from the wagon. "It's only temporary," she reminded him quickly, more for herself than for him. He smiled faintly. "Of course. Just till spring." Inside, the house carried the scent of cedar and coffee, but beneath it lingered something faintly hollow, like laughter that had been gone too long. Emma peeked out from the kitchen doorway, her eyes bright with recognition. "Miss Bennett?" she cried, running forward before remembering her manners. She stopped short, twisting her hands nervously. "Sorry, ma'am. Didn't mean to yell." Clara's sternness softened. "That's quite all right," she said. "Good morning, Emma." Ben came shyly after, holding a carved wooden horse. He didn't speak, just stared at her with quiet curiosity. When Clara smiled, he ducked behind his sister. Luke chuckled. "He'll warm up soon enough. Boy's slow to trust, but once he does, you'll have a shadow." Clara wasn't sure she wanted a shadow, but she unpacked her things anyway, a few books, a needle kit, and a little tin box of chalks she used to teach letters. Luke showed her the small room off the kitchen where she'd be staying. It was plain but warm, and for the first time in years, she didn't dread the sound of footsteps beyond her door. By the end of that first week, a rhythm began to take shape. Mornings started with porridge and lessons by the fire, afternoons with chores and quiet playtime. Emma had a sharp mind and a hunger to learn. Ben, though shy, loved to listen to stories. When Clara read aloud, his eyes would go wide with wonder. Sometimes she caught Luke standing in the doorway, arms folded, watching his children with a look that made her chest ache. Little by little, the house began to change. The rooms felt warmer, fuller. Emma's giggles would echo down the hallway, and Ben started leaving his carved toys on Clara's chair each morning, his quiet way of saying thank you. Even Luke seemed lighter, his voice carrying a trace of humor again when he spoke. One evening, Clara found him helping Emma braid her doll's hair, his big hands fumbling clumsily but gently. When he looked up and caught Clara smiling at the scene, he grinned. "Don't tell anyone," he said. "I've got a reputation to keep." She laughed before she could stop herself. The sound startled her. It had been years since laughter had escaped her lips so freely. For a moment, she forgot the weight she carried, forgot the walls she'd built. But that night, when everyone was asleep, Clara sat by her window staring out into the moonlit yard. The children's laughter still echoed faintly in her mind, and with it came an ache she couldn't name. She'd told herself this was only for the winter, yet each day made it harder to imagine walking away. The next morning, as she watched Emma teaching Ben to tie his boots, Luke stepped beside her. "Never thought I'd hear that sound again," he said softly. "What sound?" she asked. "Laughter," he said. "You brought it back." Clara turned away, her throat tightening. "It's only for a while," she whispered, though she wasn't sure which of them she was trying to convince. Luke nodded, eyes kind but knowing. "Sometimes," he said. "A while's all it takes." Winter had settled deep over the Montana plains, wrapping the world in quiet white. The wind moaned through the cottonwoods, snowdrifts gathered against the fence line, and the Double C Ranch seemed a small, glowing island in an ocean of cold. Inside, the fire burned steady, filling the house with a golden warmth that Clara had almost forgotten could exist. That night, after a long day of lessons and chores, Luke had invited her to stay for supper. "It's too late to be riding home," he'd said. "Storm's rolling in." Clara had hesitated. She didn't like overstaying, didn't like feeling beholden, but one look at the snow beginning to fall outside convinced her to stay. Now, the children slept upstairs, and the house had fallen to a hush, broken only by the hiss of the fire. Clara sat at the kitchen table, mending one of Ben's shirts. Luke sat across from her, boots propped near the hearth, quietly oiling his saddle. Neither spoke for a long while. It was the kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable anymore. Just steady. Familiar. After a while, Luke looked up from his work. "Kids think the world of you," he said softly. "Ben talks about you even in his sleep." Clara smiled faintly. "He's a sweet boy. So is Emma. You've raised them well." "Mary did most of the raising," Luke said. His voice held no bitterness, just memory. "I just try to keep things together now." Clara nodded, her fingers stilling on the needle. "You've done more than most would." Luke studied her across the table, the light catching the edges of his face. "You ever think about—" he hesitated. "About starting over? New place, new life?" Her breath caught. "No," she said quickly, maybe too quickly. "That part of me's gone." He didn't argue, just leaned back and watched the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, steady and thoughtful. "Don't seem gone to me," he said after a moment. "Seems like you've just been waiting for the right reason." Something in her chest tightened. The air between them seemed to hum softly, like the quiet just before a confession. And maybe it was the warmth of the fire or the softness in his voice, but suddenly the words she'd held back for years tumbled out. "I can't have children," she said quietly. Luke's hands went still. He didn't move, didn't even breathe, but she could feel the weight of his attention settle on her like a blanket. She forced herself to keep going. "The night of the fire. When Thomas and I lost the cabin, Her throat trembled. "I lost more than him. I lost our baby, and the doctor said I'd never—" She broke off, staring down at her lap. "I'm sorry." "I shouldn't—" "Don't," Luke said gently, setting down the saddle rag. "Don't apologize for speaking the truth." Her eyes shimmered with tears she hadn't meant to let fall. "It's why I stay alone, Mr. Callahan, why I don't go to town. People look at me and see a woman who failed at what a wife and mother are supposed to be. I can't give anyone a family." Luke rose slowly and came to stand by the fire. He didn't speak right away, just watched the flames twist and crackle. Then, without turning, he said softly, "You already have, Clara." She frowned, not understanding. He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes warm and steady. "You gave mine one back." The words struck deep and she couldn't find a reply. The silence stretched, filled only by the fire and the slow ticking of the old wall clock. Then Luke nodded toward the stairs. "Best get some rest. Storm's gonna keep us snowed in come morning." Clara nodded numbly and rose, her knees trembling slightly. When she reached the doorway, she glanced back. Luke was still standing there, his silhouette outlined in amber light, as if he were holding her sorrow like it was something fragile. Upstairs, as the wind howled against the windows, Clara lay awake, staring into the dark. For the first time in years, she didn't feel entirely alone. and that terrified her more than the storm outside. The storm broke by morning, leaving behind a world of white silence. Snow blanketed the valley, glistening under the pale winter sun. Smoke rose from the Double C's chimney, and the air smelled of wood fire and coffee. Inside, Clara moved quietly, folding blankets and tidying the hearth. The house felt different now, warmer, closer, after the things she had confessed the night before. She told herself she'd said too much. She should have stayed silent, kept her heart locked up where it belonged. Luke had been kind, but kindness didn't change truth. He needed someone whole, someone who could give his children what she couldn't. By the time Luke came in from the barn, snow clinging to his coat, Clara had her shawl around her shoulders and her satchel by the door. "You're not riding out in this," he said, frowning. "I'll be fine," she replied, forcing calm into her voice. "It's only a few miles to my place. The roads are clear enough." He shook his head. "Not with that wind. Stay another day." "I can't." Her words came out sharper than intended. She softened them quickly. "You've been kind, Mr. Callahan, but I shouldn't stay here any longer. It isn't proper." Luke leaned against the doorframe, studying her. "This about last night?" Her throat tightened. "It's about the truth. You needed to know. I can't give you what a woman should. I can't give your children brothers or sisters. I can't." He crossed the room slowly, boots creaking on the wooden floor. "Clara," he said quietly, "you think that's what I asked for?" She turned away, eyes stinging. "You should have someone who can complete your family." A soft chuckle left him, low, warm, almost tender. When she looked back, he was smiling in that way he did, with his eyes more than his mouth. He reached up and tipped his hat slightly, his voice steady but full of something deep. "Darlin, I already have one." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The words hung between them like sunlight breaking through clouds. He took a small step closer. "Emma and Ben, they've got laughter again. The house don't feel empty no more." "You gave 'em that." "You gave me that." "Family ain't just about blood or babies. It's about who stays when life breaks you in half and still finds a way to love what's left." Clara felt her lips tremble. "Luke," he held her gaze, voice softer now, "I ain't asking you to be someone else. I'm asking you to stay. To keep teaching them, to keep sitting by the fire, to keep reminding me what peace feels like. That's all." The world outside was silent except for the wind sighing across the hills. Clara looked down, her fingers clutching the edge of her shawl. For years, she'd believed she was broken beyond mending. But now, standing in this house filled with warmth and laughter and small waiting hearts, she realized maybe she wasn't broken at all. Maybe she'd just been waiting to be needed. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "Then don't. Just stay for supper." It was such a simple thing to ask, so ordinary, and yet it felt like the bravest thing she could do. Slowly she nodded. Luke's shoulders eased, and a light she hadn't seen before sparked in his eyes. That evening they sat by the fire again. Emma read from one of Clara's books, while Ben leaned against her knee, his thumb tucked under his chin. Luke sat nearby, quiet but content, the firelight tracing gold across his face. Clara looked around the room, the shelves, the worn table, the children's soft laughter, and felt something shift inside her chest. Maybe, just maybe, this was what it meant to belong. Spring came to Elk Hollow slowly, as though the land was learning how to breathe again after months of silence. The snow melted from the hills, wildflowers pushed through thawing soil, and the river swelled with new life. On the Double C Ranch, the air smelled of fresh grass and saddle leather. Calves bawled in the distance, and the steady rhythm of living had returned. Clara Bennett stayed through it all. At first, she told herself it was only until the thaw. Then it became until the children finished their lessons. Before long, she stopped setting limits at all. Her small cabin sat empty more often than not now. Luke's ranch had become her place of waking and resting, of cooking, teaching, and listening to laughter at the supper table. But with the peace came unease, too. She felt it in quiet moments, when Luke's gaze lingered a heartbeat too long, or when his hand brushed hers as they passed dishes across the table. She tried to ignore the warmth that rose inside her every time he smiled, or the way Emma and Ben clung to her skirts when she left for errands. She had built her life on restraint, on the belief that love was something she'd buried with her husband and child. And yet, here she was, alive again, frightened by her own heart. One Sunday afternoon, Luke asked her to ride with him down to the river. The cottonwoods there were just beginning to leaf, their branches whispering in the soft breeze. Clara hesitated, then agreed, knowing better than to trust herself but unable to refuse. The ride was quiet. Luke didn't fill the silence with talk. He never did. He seemed to understand that her quiet wasn't emptiness. It was safety. When they reached the riverbank, they dismounted, the water glittering beneath the late sun. "This the place I first saw you," Luke said with a faint smile, resting his hands on his belt. "Wagon stuck right over yonder. You looked like you wanted to send me packing." Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "I nearly did," he chuckled, eyes warming. "Would have deserved it. But I'm glad you didn't." They stood like that for a while, the current murmuring beside them. Then Luke turned toward her, and she knew something had changed in the air. "Clara," he said, his voice low but steady. "When Mary died, I thought that was it for me. I figured I'd raise the kids best I could and let the rest of life pass by. But you came along and somehow the house started breathing again." "I started breathing again." Her heart thudded painfully. "Luke, don't." He held up a hand, gentle but firm. "Let me finish. I ain't asking for what you think. I ain't asking for a woman to fix what's gone or give me more than I already got. I'm asking for you. Just you, to stay. To make this place home, for all of us." Her throat closed. The wind stirred the cottonwoods, and the sound was like soft applause from the heavens. She looked down at her hands, calloused but trembling. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I'm not what you need. I'm not—" Luke stepped closer, his shadow falling over hers. "You're exactly what I need. You're the piece that makes the rest of it make sense." The words undid her. Tears blurred her vision, and when she blinked, they spilled freely. "I don't know if I can be what they deserve." He smiled faintly and reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of her shawl. "You already are." For a long moment they simply stood there, the river whispering, sunlight glinting off the water, two hearts finally speaking without fear. Then, in a gesture so quiet it nearly broke her, Luke removed his hat and said softly, "Clara Bennett, will you marry me?" Her breath hitched. She looked at him, at the man who had given her back the sound of laughter and belonging. And in that moment, the walls she'd carried for years finally crumbled. "Yes," she whispered, voice trembling. "Yes, Luke, I will." He smiled, slow and certain, like sunrise after a long night. And under the cottonwoods by the river, the man who had once been a stranger took her hand and gave her back her life. The day dawned warm and golden, the kind of spring morning that seemed to hum with life. The fields shimmered with dew, the horses whinnied in the paddock, and the Double C Ranch, once a place of quiet sorrow, bustled with laughter and movement. It was Luke and Clara's wedding day. Clara stood in the small bedroom upstairs, her heart trembling like the lace at her wrists. She hadn't owned anything fancy to wear, but Emma had insisted she look like the prettiest bride in all of Wyoming. So, together, they had taken one of Clara's old Sunday dresses and sewn new lace to its collar, pressing it carefully the night before. The result was simple but lovely, soft ivory cotton that caught the morning light. In the mirror, Clara barely recognized herself. There was still the widow's calmness in her eyes, but something brighter glowed beneath it now. Peace, maybe even joy. She lifted the small locket around her neck, the one that held a faded picture of her first husband and baby. For a long moment, she whispered a prayer of thanks for what she'd lost and for what she'd found again. Downstairs, Emma's laughter rang out, joined by Ben's excited chatter. The boy had insisted on wearing his father's old vest, even though it was too big for him, and Emma had made a crown of wildflowers for Clara to wear. Luke, she knew, was outside, probably pacing the porch, pretending not to be nervous. When she finally stepped outside, every sound seemed to hush. The wind rustled through the aspens, the barn cat stretched lazily on the fence post, and Luke turned to see her, for a man so steady his breath still caught when he saw her. He removed his hat, his eyes soft and full of that quiet awe that always undid her. "You look like sunlight, Clara," he said simply. Her smile trembled. "And you look like a man who never thought he'd say words like that." He chuckled low, the sound deep and easy. "Reckon you're right." They'd chosen to marry right there on the ranch, under the cottonwood tree behind the house, the same place Luke had first asked her. It wasn't grand, but it was home. A few neighbors had gathered: Doc Harris, who'd known Luke since boyhood; Mrs. Avery, who'd helped sew Emma's new dress; and the ranch hands who stood shyly to the side, hats in hand. The preacher from town rode in on his gray mare, Bible tucked under his arm. He smiled when he saw them and said softly, "Well, I can't think of two souls more ready for grace." As the vows began, Clara's hands trembled in Luke's. She'd never imagined herself standing here again, never thought she'd have the courage to love after loss. But when Luke spoke, his words steady and true, she felt something inside her settle. "I promise," he said, voice rough with emotion, "to stand by you when the rains come and when they don't, to keep your fire lit, your laughter safe, and your heart close to mine. You made this place a home, Clara. You gave me back my family. I'll spend the rest of my days giving you the same." Tears blurred her vision. When it was her turn, her voice wavered, but every word rang clear. "I promise to walk beside you, Luke Callahan, through whatever the good Lord brings. I'll tend to your children like they were my own, and I'll love you with whatever days I have left." The preacher smiled gently. "Then, by God's grace, I now pronounce you man and wife." Luke didn't wait for applause or cheer. He simply reached out, cupped her face, and kissed her softly, slow and sure, like the sealing of a promise that had been waiting its whole life to be spoken. Cheers rose from the little crowd, and Emma squealed with delight, tugging Ben's hand. The children ran to them, arms wrapping around both adults, laughter spilling through the spring air. For the first time in years, Clara felt completely whole. Not because she'd found something new, but because she'd finally let herself be found. The ranch, the family, the love, they weren't miracles she'd earned. They were blessings she'd learned to open her heart to, and as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in gold and rose, Clara Callahan knew she was home. The summer that followed their wedding was one of the gentlest Elk Hollow had seen in years. The land, once dry and stubborn, bloomed with wildflowers. The river shimmered like a ribbon of silver through the valley, and the hills were thick with grass. Life, at last, had found its rhythm again on the Double C Ranch. Clara Callahan woke early most mornings to the sounds of the ranch coming alive, the soft nickering of horses, the clatter of pails in the barn, and the laughter of Emma and Ben echoing through the yard. She loved those sounds. They were the song of a home, rebuilt from silence. Inside the house, the scent of fresh bread often mingled with the wood smoke from the stove. Clara had made small changes over time. A quilt she'd sewn draped over the back of Luke's chair, her books filling the shelves by the fire, a vase of wildflowers always brightening the kitchen table. It wasn't about ownership or decoration. It was about roots. Every touch of hers was a quiet statement. I belong here. Luke had softened too. He still carried himself like the steady rancher he'd always been, but his laughter came easier now, and the shadows behind his eyes had lifted. He'd started teaching Ben to rope and ride, and though the boy was more mischief than muscle, Luke's patience never wavered. Emma, ever the dreamer, spent her afternoons helping Clara in the garden, talking about books and dresses and the future she wanted someday. Sometimes, Clara would watch them from the porch, the man and the children who had once been strangers, and marvel at how love could grow from the simplest acts of care. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a steady warmth, the kind that healed without asking permission. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Luke came up behind her on the porch, arms slipping around her waist. He rested his chin lightly on her shoulder. "Looks like rain tomorrow," he murmured. She smiled. "Good. The beans could use it." He chuckled low. "You talk about those beans like they're your kin." "Maybe they are," she teased softly. "They're rooted, stubborn, and always trying to grow." He kissed her temple. "Sounds about right." They stood in silence, watching the sky turn gold and violet. The world around them felt full of life, of peace, of a promise kept. For the first time in years, neither of them was waiting for something to go wrong. Inside, Emma's voice carried through the open door. "Pa, Miss Clara! Supper's ready." Clara turned, smiling. "You hear that? Our little lady runs the place now." Luke grinned. "She learned from the best." As they sat down to supper, Ben said grace, short and sweet, the way a boy of 7 might. "Thank you, Lord, for the food and the cows and for Ma's bread." He paused, then added, "And for Ma, too." The word hit Clara softly, like a hand brushing her heart. Ma. Luke met her eyes across the table, his smile saying what words couldn't. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed, Luke and Clara sat by the fire. The flames flickered low, throwing soft light across the room. She leaned against him, their hands twined together. "Do you ever think about before?" she asked quietly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But mostly I think about now. And now?" He smiled, kissing her hand. "Now feels like forever." Clara closed her eyes, letting the peace settle in her bones. The years of loneliness, the ache of loss, all of it had led her here to this quiet evening in a house full of warmth. She finally understood what Luke had meant that winter morning when he'd said, "Darlin, I already have one." He hadn't been talking about the family he'd lost. He'd been talking about the one they'd built, together. And as the fire crackled softly and the night wrapped around their home, Clara Callahan knew without doubt that she was, at last, exactly where she was meant to be. Home.